The sun over Wyatt's Crossing was a liar. It shone down on the town square that spring of 1883, bright and generous, but it gave no warmth to the one place that needed it most. The auction block. Folks called it a helping hand sale, the way a cornered wolf might call itself a lost pup. Everyone knew better. They weren't here for cattle or tools, they were here for people who'd run clean out of road. And today, the main attraction was Clara. She stood barefoot on the sun-bleached planks, wrists raw where the rope had bit into her skin. She was tall, taller than most men in the crowd that had gathered to stare, broad-shouldered, with a back as straight and steady as a fence post in a storm. Her father once told her that strength was a blessing. He'd laughed, proud, as she lifted things even he struggled with. Neighbors used to borrow that strength to ride a wagon or clear a fallen tree. Now, those same neighbors looked at her with mouths curled like burnt paper. "Who'd marry that?" someone snickered from the back. "Break a man's back on the wedding night," another one slurred, his words thick with cheap whiskey and casual cruelty. Clara didn't flinch. She'd learned long ago how to swallow words like they were nails, how to keep from bleeding where anyone could see. Her family, what was left of them after a winter that took the crops and then their mercy, had traded her. 1 sack of flour and a pound of lard for their too big, too strong daughter. She was too much, they'd said. No future here. They sold the one thing she'd never learned how to hide. Herself. Clyde Hargrove, the auctioneer with a smile as slick as snake oil, slapped the railing beside her. $50, he boomed. For a working woman, strong as a draft mule and twice as useful. No hands went up. The crowd just shuffled its feet. 40 then! Hargrove's smile was starting to crack. Silence. 30! He started pacing the stage, his frustration a visible thing. Clara's mind drifted away, back to a better year. She was 8 years old, snow piled up to her shins, hauling split logs beside her father. They were both laughing, the sound of it echoing in the cold, crisp air. That sound felt 1,000 miles away now, farther than any mountain. 25? Hargrove snapped, all the fake sweetness gone from his voice. Final offer, gentlemen. Nobody moved. A woman near the front squinted at Clara, judging her like you'd judge a broken piece of furniture. A couple of young cowhands just smirked, sharing a silent, ugly joke. The sun beat down, hot and unforgiving, but the shame was colder, so much colder. And then the crowd started to turn away. One by one, they lost interest. They were done with the show. But then a new sound cut through the murmurs. Footsteps. Slow, even. The sound of a man not bothered by the heat or the stares or the ugliness of this whole affair. A cowboy stepped out from the edge of the crowd. His coat was a simple trail duster, his hat pulled low, casting his face in shadow. He didn't need an introduction. He had the kind of presence that announced itself. He didn't stare at Clara like she was a freak on display. He looked at her the way a man looks at a good horse standing in a storm. He was measuring her stamina, not her size. He didn't haggle. He didn't shout a bid. He just walked right up to the stage. He climbed the steps, set his hat on the post, and then he did something no one saw coming. Without asking permission from the auctioneer, or the crowd, or anyone, he slid one arm behind Clara's back and the other beneath her knees, and he lifted her. Just like that. A collective gasp went through the crowd. A man's beer mug stopped halfway to his lips. Even Hargrove's jaw fell slack, his mouth hanging open like a broken gate. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. This could have been the final humiliation. One last insult to cap off a day full of them, to be carried off like a sack of grain. But it wasn't. The way he held her was solid, respectful, like a blacksmith moving a priceless anvil. There was no strain in his arms, no gloating look on his face. He held her as if she weighed nothing at all. He turned to the crowd, the sea of faces that had measured her by her height and not her heart. And he spoke. His voice was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that travels farther than any shout. "You're just right for my arms." The entire town square went still, so still you could have heard a pin drop. Mockery has a funny way of shriveling up when it comes face to face with pure, uncut certainty. And this man, he was nothing but certain. Clara felt her eyes sting. Not from shame this time, from the shock of it. The shock of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. Hargrove finally snapped out of it, snatching the man's coins from his hand, his fingers moving fast. The crowd tried to find its voice, tried to make sense of what just happened, but they couldn't. The cowboy, Thomas, someone whispered his name, stepped down from the stage. He kept Clara balanced in his arms, dignified, as if he were escorting a lady from a fine carriage, not carrying a woman off an auction block. They moved through the parted sea of onlookers. No one dared to jeer now. No one even dared to look him in the eye. A few men lowered their heads. A few even tipped their hats. Most just stared, spellbound, as Thomas carried the woman the town had treated like a problem, and in one simple act, reminded them all that she was a person. He walked her to his wagon and set her down gently on the board seat. He didn't preach. He didn't explain. He just took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders, covering the rope burns on her wrists. He was a man who understood the difference between pity and protection. Behind them, the auctioneer was already calling for the next lot. The crowd started buzzing again. The sun kept on shining its lie. But for one woman and one man, the world had tilted on its axis. If you were standing in that square, you would have felt it too. The sudden, unseen reweighing of a life. Clara didn't know where this road was leading. Thomas hadn't promised her a future. All he'd promised was what he'd already given her. A better measure. And sometimes that's where the real story begins. The wagon creaked out of Wyatt's Crossing, each turn of the wheels carrying Clara further from the shame of that town square. The jeers of the crowd still echoed in her head, a bitter ghost she couldn't shake. Beside her, Thomas sat silent as a stone, the reins held loose in his hands, his hat still pulled low against the glare of the sun. He hadn't said another word since he lifted her off that stage, but his silence wasn't empty, it was solid. The silence of a man who knew when words were just wasted breath. Finally, Clara found her voice. It came out rough, a rasp of dust and pride. "You didn't have to buy me." Thomas's gaze stayed fixed on the trail ahead. His reply was plain, calm, without a trace of pity. "I didn't buy you," he said, his voice even. "I stopped a circus. That's all. They were turning you into a spectacle, and I don't play along with that sort of thing." Her chest felt tight. 1,000 questions burned in her mind. What did he want with her? What was she supposed to be now? A servant? Something else? But before she could force the words out, he reached behind the seat. He pulled out a folded wool blanket and held it out to her. "For the rope burns," he said. Not with pity, but with a simple, matter-of-fact care that struck her harder than any kindness she'd ever known. She hesitated for a second, then took it, draping it over her shoulders. It smelled of pine and saddle leather and something else. Something like safety. A warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the wool. It was the simple, staggering fact that someone had noticed her pain. They rolled on through the sagebrush hills as the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was waiting, like a story that hadn't found its ending yet. Suddenly, 2 riders appeared on the ridge above them, their horses kicking up plumes of dust. One of them, a man with a cruel smirk, tipped his hat towards Thomas. "Still collectin' strays, Thomas?" he called down, his voice dripping with mockery. Clara went stiff, her old shame twisting like a knife in her gut. She expected Thomas to shout back, to defend her, to defend himself. But he didn't. His jaw tightened, a muscle flicking under his skin, but he just clicked the reins and kept the wagon moving steady. The men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that followed them for a long time before it finally faded into the wind. Clara risked a glance at him. His restraint, his refusal to be drawn into their filth, spoke louder than any angry words could have. He didn't need to prove anything, not to them. By twilight, the wagon dipped down into a narrow canyon. The land rose up around them, tall cliffs on either side, sheltering a small valley that was hidden from the rest of the world. And there, nestled against a stand of tall pines, was Thomas's home. It wasn't a grand ranch house, just a modest cabin of rough-hewn logs and stone, with a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. A corral stood off to one side, a few horses grazing peacefully inside. There were no ranch hands shouting, no bustling activity. There was just the land, the animals, and the quiet man who tended to them. Clara climbed down from the wagon, her bare feet crunching on the gravel. She looked at the cabin. It seemed weathered and lonely, and for some reason, that made her own chest ache. For her whole life, she'd been told she was too much, too big, too strong, too much for any normal place to hold. But standing here, in front of this simple, solitary house, she felt a strange flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found a place that wouldn't ask her to shrink. The cabin door creaked open as Thomas led her inside. The air smelled of wood smoke and old iron. It was clean, sparse, a man's home, but it held something she hadn't felt in a very, very long time. A quiet that wasn't cruel. The kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for a future to be written. As she set the borrowed coat on a peg by the door, her eyes were drawn to the stone hearth. Above the mantelpiece, in a simple wooden frame, hung a small, faded photograph. A young woman looked out from the picture, her hair tossed by a wind that wasn't there, a smile on her face that was both fragile and fiercely determined. "She's beautiful," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas, who had been moving to light a lamp, froze, just for a breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, stripped of all the quiet strength he usually carried. It was the sound of a wound that had never healed. "Eliza," he said. "She was going to be my wife." The name seemed to hang in the air, echoing off the log walls. He didn't turn to look at her, he just stared at the photograph, his face a mask of old grief. Slowly, the story came out. Each word seemed to be carved from a deep, painful place inside him. "We were ambushed on the road back from Willow Creek. 5 men. They wanted the horses." His voice grew thick. She didn't make it back." He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the silent cabin. "Sheriff called it bad luck. A robbery gone wrong." He finally turned from the photo, and his eyes were like chips of gray ice. "But luck had nothing to do with it. I still hear her voice sometimes, when the wind is just right." Clara's chest tightened, but it wasn't with pity. It was with a shock of recognition. They were both marked by loss, just in different ways. She stepped closer to the fire, the flickering light casting her long shadow against the wall. "And yet, you lifted me off that platform today. Why?" Thomas finally met her gaze, his own eyes reflecting the firelight. "Because I saw something familiar in your eyes," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not your size, your spirit. The world has tried to break you, and you're still standing. You're not astray, Clara. You're just someone the world misunderstood." And for the first time in as long as she could remember, the heavy cloak of shame that had always clung to her shoulders felt just a little bit lighter. In his words, she wasn't a burden. She wasn't too much. She was seen. But as the days turned into weeks, a new kind of silence settled over the ranch. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the cabin. It was a heavy, pressing silence that made Clara feel like she had to be constantly moving, constantly doing, just to keep from being crushed by it. She rose before the dawn, not because Thomas ever asked her to. He never did. But because the stillness felt like an accusation. She chopped wood until her arms ached, hauled water from the creek until her shoulders burned, swept the porch until the boards were clean enough to eat off of. It wasn't about earning her keep. It was about survival. If her hands were busy, her mind couldn't dwell on the jeering faces in the crowd. If her body was tired, the ghosts of that auction square couldn't find her in her sleep. Thomas never said a word about it. He never stopped her, never praised her. But he watched. He was a man who noticed every little detail, even if he seldom spoke of them. His quiet gaze followed her as she moved about the ranch, a silent witness to her restless energy. Then one afternoon something changed. Clara was walking back into the cabin after stacking the last of the firewood. As she stepped through the door, she braced herself, as she always did, to duck her head, but she didn't need to. She stopped, confused, and looked up. The wooden frame of the doorway, the one that had grazed the top of her head every single time she passed through it, was higher, at least by a hand's breadth. There was no announcement, no explanation, just more space, more room where there hadn't been before. A few nights later, she sat down for supper at the small wooden table. But as she settled into her chair, she paused. It felt different, stronger. She looked down. It wasn't the old, rickety, spindle-back chair she'd been using. This one was new, made of solid oak, its legs thick and sturdy, its back wide and solid, built to last, built to hold. Her breath caught in her throat. She ran a hand over the smooth, sanded wood, a strange tightness in her chest. When Thomas came in from the barn and set his tools on the workbench, she found her voice. "Thank you," she whispered, not looking at him. He didn't look up from wiping the grease from his hands. His reply was simple, almost gruff. "About time the house fit both of us." The words were plain, unadorned, but they hit her with the force of a physical blow. For her entire life, she had tried to make herself smaller, to hunch her shoulders, to stoop, to take up less space, to try and fit into a world that was too small for her. She had been the one who was always expected to change, to adapt, to shrink. And here was a man who, without a single word of discussion, had quietly widened his world to make a place for her. He hadn't asked her to change. He'd changed the house instead. But the world outside that hidden valley hadn't changed at all. A trip into Wyatt's Crossing for supplies was a harsh reminder of that. The saloon was a pit of smoke and noise, a place where the laughter was always a little too loud, a little too cruel. Clara followed Thomas inside, instinctively trying to make herself invisible, even though she knew it was impossible. Heads turned the moment they walked in. The off-key piano music faltered. The buzz of conversation died down, replaced by a low murmur of whispers and snickers. It didn't take long for the trouble to find her. A man, his face flushed with whiskey and malice, pushed himself away from a table. He swayed on his feet, a sloppy, mean-spirited grin on his face. "Well, well," he slurred, his eyes fixed on Clara. "Look what Thomas dragged in. Hey, big girl, bet you could toss me clear across the room with one hand." The men at his table roared with laughter. Each laugh was like a punch to Clara's ribs. She lowered her eyes, a hot flush of shame creeping up her neck. She could feel every eye in the room on her, judging her, mocking her. The drunk took a stumbling step forward and reached out, his dirty hand grabbing her by the wrist. "Come on, show us what you can do." Clara froze, the old familiar feeling of helplessness threatening to choke her. But before she could even react, Thomas moved. He was a blur of motion, faster than the piano player could stop his song. In an instant, he was at the man's side. His hand shot out, not in a punch, but in a grip of pure iron, clamping down on the drunk's wrist. With a single sharp twist, the man yelped in pain. His beer mug clattered to the floor, spilling ale across the dusty boards. The saloon went dead silent. Thomas leaned in close to the man, his voice a low, steady growl that cut through the silence like a razor. "Touch her again," he said, his words perfectly clear, perfectly calm, and utterly terrifying. "And you'll answer to me." The drunk stumbled backward, clutching his wrist, his face pale. The fight had gone out of him completely. He was too stunned, too scared to even reply. This time, nobody laughed. The piano player's hands hovered, frozen, over the keys. Clara's chest was tight, but it wasn't from fear. It was from a new, powerful emotion she couldn't name. For the first time in her life, someone hadn't looked away, someone hadn't joined in the laughter, someone had stood up for her. Not out of pity, but to defend her dignity, as if it were a precious thing. They left the saloon without another word being spoken. Outside, the night air was cool, but Clara felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. As they walked toward the wagon, she broke the silence. "You didn't have to do that." Thomas glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light from the saloon windows. But his words were plain and simple. "Yes," he said, "I did." She looked away, her heart hammering against her ribs. By the time they reached the porch of the cabin, her voice was soft, almost tentative. "You're not like other men." He stopped and turned to face her. For the first time all night, he met her eyes directly. "And you're not like other women." She'd heard those words her whole life. They had always been a curse, a weapon used to cut her down, to make her feel like a freak. But coming from him, in the quiet of the night, they carried no sting of mockery. They weren't an insult. They were just the truth. Simple and steady. And for the very first time, they sounded like a compliment. The afternoon sun was weak, filtering through the cracks in the old storage barn, and catching the dust motes as they danced in the still, quiet air. Clara was looking for a coil of rope, shifting a heavy, dust-covered trunk out of the way. As she moved it, something caught her eye. A roll of parchment, yellowed with age,
wedged between a wooden crate and the barn wall. Curiosity got the better of her.
She pulled it free, the paper crackling in protest, and carefully unrolled it across a nearby workbench. At first glance, it looked like any other rancher's map. Fencing lines, paddocks, irrigation channels, all sketched out in neat, precise strokes. But as she looked closer, she saw other symbols in the margins, brands she didn't recognize, and then one mark that she did, a stylized RS, Redstone Holdings. The name was a whisper that traveled across counties, a sprawling ranching empire run by a ruthless man named Silas Merritt, a man few people trusted and many people feared. Clara traced the faded ink with her finger, her heart starting to beat a little faster. These weren't just plans for a ranch. They told a story of land that was desired, land that was fought over, land that someone had tried and failed to take. The map showed Thomas's property, but it was surrounded by land already marked with the Redstone brand. His small valley was like an island in the middle of Merritt's ocean. That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, she couldn't hold the question in any longer. Who is Silas Merritt? Her voice was quiet, but it landed in the silent cabin with the weight of a stone. Thomas was sharpening a knife, the rhythmic shink, shink of stone on steel the only sound in the room. He froze mid-stroke, the silence stretched out taut and heavy. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he carefully set both the blade and the whetstone aside. His jaw was tight, his face like a mask carved from granite. He came to me about 10 years back, Thomas said finally, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Wanted this land, offered me more money than it was worth, twice over. He stared into the flames, his eyes seeing something far away. I told him no. This valley belonged to my father, and his father before him. It's not for sale. His eyes darkened with a memory that was still raw. So he tried another way. He went behind my back. He asked my fiancée, Eliza, for her hand. Offered her a life of luxury, fancy dresses, a big house in the city. He thought if he had her, I'd have no choice but to fold, to sell the land as part of some dowry. His hand clenched into a fist on his knee. She refused him, laughed in his face. He took a deep, shuddering breath. Not long after that, the old barn, it went up in flames. She was inside, checking on a sick foal. He looked up from the fire, his eyes filled with a grief so profound it made Clara's own chest ache. There was no proof, no witnesses. The sheriff called it a tragic accident, a stray spark from a lantern. But I knew better. Merritt doesn't take no for an answer. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. The quiet grief that always clung to him, his caution, his solitude. It wasn't just sadness. It was a silent, unending war. So you live like this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alone, waiting, because you know justice will never come. Thomas finally looked at her, truly looked at her, the firelight reflecting in his haunted gray eyes. Justice doesn't come by waiting, Clara, he said, his voice low and hard as iron. It comes by holding on. It comes by refusing to break when men like him are doing everything in their power to see you shatter. The words settled between them, heavy and final. Clara carefully rolled up the parchment map, her hands trembling slightly. She understood now. She understood the true weight of his solitude. And she understood the cold, dangerous fire that was still smoldering just beneath the surface. The quiet peace of the valley was shattered. Clara had started to find a rhythm on the ranch, a sense of purpose in the hard physical work. Mending fences, tending to the horses, chopping wood. Her strength for the first time felt less like a curse and more like a tool. But every trip into town was a brutal reminder that acceptance was a fragile thing, easily broken. It started with whispers, little poisoned barbs tossed from behind cupped hands and lowered veils. Then, it escalated. One afternoon, Clara was leaving the tannery, a heavy parcel of leather for saddle repairs balanced in her arms. Across the dusty street, a group of women stood in front of the fabric store, their bonnets tilted together like a flock of vultures. Their laughter, sharp and cutting, rippled across the square. "That's her," one of them sneered, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet afternoon. "The giant girl. Poor Thomas. He must have finally lost his mind." "She'll break his bones before she ever bears him a son," another added, and they all tittered with cruel delight. Clara's cheeks burned hot with shame. She clutched the bundle tighter and turned to leave, wanting nothing more than to disappear. But in her haste, her boot caught on the edge of the wooden sidewalk. She stumbled, and the heavy package of leather slipped from her grasp, hitting the ground with a dull, final thud. The women's laughter broke loose then, high-pitched and merciless. It washed over her, a wave of pure humiliation that rooted her to the spot. She just stood there, frozen, the sound of their mockery clawing at her throat. Then she heard bootsteps, steady, unhurried. Thomas. He didn't shout at them. He didn't even look at them. He walked directly to her, placing himself between her and the jeering women. He knelt down, picked up the bundle of leather, and carefully brushed the dust from it, handling it as if it were a priceless treasure. Then he placed it gently back into Clara's arms. He looked at her hands, then lifted his gaze to the women across the street. His voice was calm, but it carried with an authority that silenced them instantly. "These," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, "are not hands for shame." His eyes swept over their stunned faces. They are hands that build, hands that save. They are stronger and more honest than any hands in this town, and you are not worthy to speak of them. The silence that followed was deafening. The laughter died in their throats, their cruel smiles frozen on their faces. Not another word was spoken. Thomas turned back to Clara, his expression soft. "You ready to go?" She could only nod, her throat too tight with emotion to speak. They walked away together, side by side, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like someone was standing in front of her to shield her. She felt like someone was standing beside her. But words have wings, and cruelty travels faster than kindness. By the end of the week, the whispers had grown fangs. Silas Merritt's influence ran deep in Wyatt's Crossing, and he was using it to poison the well. "She's cursed," someone muttered in the saloon. "Wherever she goes, misfortune is sure to follow." "Big as a barn and twice as dangerous," another man said at the Mercantile, spitting into the dirt as she passed. Mothers began to pull their children away from her, their eyes filled with a suspicion that Merritt had carefully planted. The town was turning on her, their fear stoked by a rich man's lies. If she had been a stranger before, now she was an outcast, a monster. One night, Clara stood on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring out at the moonlit hills. Her jaw was set in a hard line. "If I go," she said, her voice brittle on the verge of breaking, "he'll have no more reason to stir the town against you. The fire will die out if I'm not here to fuel it." Thomas, who had been sitting on the porch steps repairing a leather harness, looked up at her. His face was like a shadow, but his voice was steady as a rock. "No, Clara," he said. "If you leave, they won't stop. They'll just find someone else to burn. Men like Silas Merritt don't stop when they win. They only stop when there's nothing left for them to take." She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt, any hesitation. But there was none. There was only the calm, unyielding strength of a man who had already lost too much to run away. Her throat tightened. Her first instinct had always been to retreat. When her family sold her, when the crowd mocked her, when the whispers turned to poison, survival had always meant escape. But here was someone telling her that survival wasn't enough, that standing her ground, even when she was under fire, was the only real way to win. She turned away, hugging herself against the chill of the night. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that," she whispered to the darkness. Thomas rose from the step and walked to her side. He didn't touch her. He just placed his hand on the porch railing next to hers. A quiet, steady presence. "Clara," he said, his voice soft. "You've carried more weight on your shoulders than most men will in their entire lives. You don't need to prove your strength to me or to them. But you need to know this." He paused, and she felt his gaze on her. "You are not a burden, not to this land and not to me. If you stay, it won't be because you're trapped. It'll be because you finally choose not to run." The words sank into her, quiet and deep, like seeds planted in the frozen ground. For the first time, she considered that staying might not mean being a prisoner. It might mean putting down roots, roots strong enough to weather any storm. The fire of gossip still burned hot in town, but on that porch, under the cold, silent stars, a different kind of flame flickered to life inside her. Small, fragile, but for the first time, truly her own. The first true fire didn't come from gossip. It came from torches. Clara woke from a dead sleep, the sharp, acrid smell of smoke stinging her nostrils. It was the deepest part of the night, a moonless, starless dark. Through the small window of her room, she saw it. An angry orange glow flickering against the side of the barn. Shadows moved through the light, fast, frantic shapes. 5, maybe 6 men. Their lanterns swung wildly as they smashed fence rails, their shouts mingling with the terrified screams of the horses trapped inside. Silas Merritt's whispered threats had finally taken shape. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. Barefoot, wearing only her nightdress, she ran out into the night. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning hay. Sparks lifted into the dark sky like a swarm of angry fireflies. She reached the stable just as the flames began to lick up the dry timber walls. Inside, the horses were going insane with fear, their eyes wide and white, slamming their bodies against the wooden stalls. One wild kick in the chaos could break a leg, could kill them all, could kill her. Clara didn't hesitate. She wrenched the heavy stable gate open, flinging it wide, and stood in the opening, spreading her arms out like a shield against the flames and the fear. "Easy now," she whispered, her voice low and firm, a steady anchor in the storm of panic. It was a calm she didn't feel, but a calm she projected with every ounce of her being. "I'm here! I'm here! No one is going to touch you!" The panicked herd shifted, their powerful bodies trembling, but her presence, her impossible stillness in the face of the fire, seemed to hold them. They quieted, their terror giving way to a fragile trust. A figure lunged at her from the darkness, a heavy club raised to strike her down. But before the blow could land, another body slammed into him from the side, a blur of motion in the firelight. Thomas. His fist connected with a sickening crunch, and the man went down hard in the dirt. Shouts erupted from the other raiders. Then, a new sound, more footsteps, more voices, pounding through the darkness toward them. Clara's heart sank. They were outnumbered, but these weren't enemies. They were townspeople, men carrying axes and pitchforks, women carrying buckets and nothing but their own bare hands. And all of them, every single one, carried something fiercer than any weapon: resolve. The very same people who had whispered and sneered now spread across the yard, shoulder to shoulder, forming a human wall between the raiders and the ranch. Merritt's thugs faltered. Their torches wavered in their hands. They had expected 2 terrified people, alone in the dark. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected a community. They hadn't expected a fight. One of them cursed, then another, and then, as quickly as they had come, they melted back into the darkness, leaving only the crackle of the dying fire and the smell of smoke behind. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the sound of the calming horses and Clara's own ragged breathing. Sweat and ash were smeared across her skin. She stood frozen in the gateway, her body trembling with adrenaline, scarcely believing what had just happened. They had faced them down, and they had won. Then a pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her back from the heat of the embers. Thomas held her close, his voice ringing out in the night, loud enough for everyone to hear. It was louder than the fire, steadier than the stars above. "She's not too much," he said, his voice thick with a raw, powerful emotion. "She's the reason we're all still standing." The crowd, the people who were so quick to laugh, so quick to judge, said nothing. They just watched. A man took off his hat. A woman nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. In the smoky, star-dusted darkness, respect filled the silence where mockery used to live. Clara was no longer the girl who was sold for being too big. In the heart of the fire, she had been forged into something new. She was their protector. She was the heart at the center of the storm. And for the first time, the whole town knew it. Beneath the quiet hush of the stars, the night after the raid, Thomas finally spoke the name he had kept buried for so many years. Clara hadn't pushed. She had simply existed in the space his grief had carved out, a silent witness to the faded photograph that hung like a ghost over his hearth. His jaw was tight, but at last he gave the ghost a name. "Eliza," he said again, but this time it wasn't just a name. It was the beginning of a story he had to tell. He told her everything, about how Silas Merritt hadn't just wanted the land. He'd wanted Eliza too. He'd seen her as another beautiful thing to own, another piece of property to add to his collection. When she had refused him, his pride had turned to poison. The fire. It wasn't an accident, Thomas said, his voice a low, rough whisper. It wasn't for the barn. It was for me. Merritt's men were waiting for me on the road. But I was delayed in town. Eliza went to the barn alone. His voice broke. They thought she was me. On paper, the sheriff had ruled it an accident. In Thomas's bones, it was murder, cold-blooded and calculated. And the man responsible was still walking free, growing richer and more powerful every day. Clara's heart clenched, not with jealousy, but with a deep shared grief for the wound that was still so raw in him. Is that why you live like this? She asked softly. Alone? So shut off from everyone? His gaze, when it met hers, was steady and completely unguarded. At first, yes, he admitted. It was easier to let the world think I was strange, broken, than to risk losing anyone else I cared about. He paused, his breath heavy in the quiet night. And maybe when I first brought you here, a part of me thought you could fill that space she left. You were strong, a fighter, someone who could stand beside me and help me hold on to this land. Clara looked down at her hands, a flicker of hurt crossing her face. Was that all she was? A replacement, a soldier in his private war. But Thomas wasn't finished. He stepped closer, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. The firelight caught the raw, painful honesty in his eyes. But not anymore, he said, his voice firm, resolute. Because you are not her. You are not a ghost. You are not anyone's shadow, Clara. He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. You are the reason I'm starting to believe that people like us, people the world has tried to break, deserve more than just grief. You make me believe in a future again. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the eaves of the cabin, a soft, steady sigh, as if the land itself were exhaling. Clara swallowed against the ache in her chest. It wasn't the ache of shame anymore. It was the ache of recognition. She wasn't a stand-in. She wasn't a burden. She was chosen, here, in the present, by a man who was finally ready to lay his ghost to rest. The little chapel in Wyatt's Crossing smelled of old dust and candle wax. The pews were packed tight, not for a Sunday sermon, but for a different kind of preaching. Silas Merritt stood at the pulpit, his expensive suit looking out of place, his voice dripping with a smooth, practiced confidence that came from years of buying and bullying his way through life. I warned you all, he declared, his finger pointing directly at Clara, who stood near the back. He made her feel like an intruder, a contamination. This woman was bought and sold like a piece of livestock, a monster paraded through our town for your amusement. And now she lives among you, a threat to your children, your homes, your very way of life. A murmur rippled through the pews. Some faces were fearful, some were angry, but most were just uncertain, their loyalties swaying in the wind of Merritt's powerful words. Clara stood frozen, his words digging into old wounds she thought had finally started to heal. The shame, the humiliation, it all came rushing back. For a moment, she wanted to turn and run, to flee the suffocating judgment of all those eyes. But then she thought of Thomas's words. You are not a shadow. Slowly, deliberately, she started to walk down the central aisle. Each footstep echoed in the tense silence of the chapel. The weight of every eye in the room was on her back, a physical pressure trying to crush her. But she refused to bend. When she reached the front, standing just below the pulpit where Merritt loomed over her, she did not shout. She did not plead or beg for their understanding. Instead, she reached to her belt and slid the woodcutter's axe from its loop. She held it in her hands, not as a weapon, but as a symbol, a testament. If being strong is a crime, Clara said, her voice not loud, but clear and calm and ringing with a truth that silenced the entire chapel, then I am guilty. The silence that followed was so deep, so absolute, that the gentle crackle of the altar candles sounded like thunder. She lifted the axe slightly, its polished head gleaming in the dim light. "This axe," she said, her eyes moving from face to face in the crowd, "split the firewood that kept your children warm in the schoolhouse this winter. It helped mend the fence that kept your cattle from wandering onto the railroad tracks. And a few nights ago, it stood between your homes and the torches of men who would see this whole town burn to the ground." She then turned her gaze upward, locking eyes with Silas Merritt. Her voice was steady, unwavering. "You call me a monster, but the only thing you truly fear, Mr. Merritt, is that a woman like me doesn't need your permission or your money or your approval to be worth something." For a heartbeat, the chapel was breathless. Then, from the front pew, an old woman, Mrs. Gable, slowly rose to her feet. She just nodded once, a silent, powerful affirmation. A farmer stood up next, then the schoolteacher, and then another, and another, until nearly half the town was standing. There were no cheers, no shouts, just the quiet, unshakable weight of their defiance. Clara lowered the axe, but she kept her chin held high. She had spoken her truth, and the town, for the first time, had truly listened. The late summer air was brittle and dry. Weeks without rain had turned the fields of golden wheat into a tinderbox. When the town's alarm bell began to toll, its frantic ringing sounded sharper, more urgent than any Sunday sermon. Clara and Thomas were already on their feet, the smell of smoke sharp in the air. On the ridge overlooking the town, an orange light was climbing the sky, a hungry predator growing brighter and fiercer with every gust of wind. By the time they reached the edge of town, Dennis McGregor's wheat field, months of back-breaking work, a family's entire hope for the year, was already a wall of roaring fire. But something was worse than the loss of the grain. The wind had shifted. It was bending the flames, driving the inferno directly towards the town's barns, and beyond them, the tightly clustered wooden homes of Wyatt's Crossing. A fire there wouldn't just ruin a season, it would destroy the entire town. Shouts of panic rose up all around them. Men and women ran with buckets of water, their desperate efforts hissing uselessly against the blaze. It was like trying to put out the sun with a teacup. "We need a fire break!" Thomas shouted over the roar, his arm shielding his eyes from the intense heat. "We have to cut it off!" Clara's eyes scanned the property, her mind racing faster than the fear that was trying to grip her. She saw the line of barns, the panicked people, the approaching wall of flames. And then she saw it. The old livestock wall. A relic from the town's founding, it stood just beyond the last barn. 30 feet long, made of massive, thick timber posts, it was sagging with age and rot. Useless, but not to her. If it came down, if she could bring it down, it would create a barrier, a wide earthen wound in the land that could starve the fire of its fuel. "It would take 10 men in an hour to bring that down," Thomas yelled, seeing where she was looking. But Clara was already running. Her boots pounded against the parched, cracked earth. She reached the first massive beam, a piece of timber as thick as her own body. She wrapped both of her arms around it, dug her bare feet into the dirt for leverage, and heaved. The muscles in her arms and back screamed in protest, burning like iron in a forge. Her breath tore through her lungs. With a raw, guttural roar that came from the deepest part of her soul, she pulled. The post groaned, resisted, and then cracked free from the earth with a sound like a pistol shot, sending up a spray of dirt and splinters. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers who had stopped fighting the fire to stare at her. She didn't pause. She moved to the next beam, and the next, and the next. She was a force of nature, tearing the old structure apart with her bare hands. The ancient wall groaned and protested like a dying beast. Sweat stung her eyes. Ash coated her skin and filled her lungs. But she kept pulling, dragging, yanking with a strength that didn't seem human. The whole wall began to tremble. With one final furious heave, she threw all of her weight against the central post. It snapped. The entire 30-foot structure crashed to the ground with a thunderous crack that shook the very ground. The fire hit the newly cleared earth, the barrier she had created. It spat and sparked, but it could go no further. The flames, starved of fuel, were forced sideways, their momentum broken. The townspeople, seeing their chance, rallied. Buckets flew, shovels dug into the dirt, and within minutes, the blaze began to weaken. By the time the last spark hissed into darkness, The field was a blackened, smoking ruin, but the barns, the homes, the town itself, they were still standing. A stunned silence fell, broken only by the ragged, smoke-filled breaths of the people she had just saved. Clara stood in the wreckage of the wall she had destroyed, her hands raw and bleeding, still gripping a splintered piece of wood. She turned slowly, half expecting the old reactions: fear, suspicion, ridicule. Instead, she saw faces she hardly recognized, faces filled with awe, with gratitude, and with something she had never seen directed at her before: respect. Dennis McGregor, his face streaked with soot, his hat crushed in his hands, stepped forward. "You saved my barn," he said, his voice thick with emotion. A woman's voice echoed his, trembling. "You saved my daughter," she cried. "She was asleep inside the house." The murmurs swelled, not of mockery this time, but of thanks. Hands reached out, not to push her away, but to clap her on the shoulder, to steady her, to honor her. For the first time in her life, Clara felt the weight of her strength not as a curse that isolated her, but as a gift she had shared. Through the crowd, Thomas appeared, his shirt torn, his face black with ash. He didn't hesitate. He walked right up to her, took her hand, the one still clutching the splintered wood, and closed his own fingers firmly around it. He raised their joined hands for everyone to see, his voice carrying over the silent, watching crowd. "She's not too big," he declared, his voice ringing with pride. "She's the reason we're all still standing here tonight." The words cut through the smoky air like a church bell. Men nodded, women pressed their hands to their hearts, and standing near the road, astride his fine horse, Silas Merritt shifted uneasily in his saddle. For months he had stoked the town's fear with whispers and lies. But tonight, nobody was looking at him. Nobody moved to his side. Someone muttered, "Coward," didn't even bring a bucket. Another man spat in the dirt in his direction, and then, as if guided by a single, unspoken thought, the crowd turned away from him. They closed ranks, their shoulders forming a protective circle, not around the rich man on his horse, but around Clara. The isolation he had so carefully crafted for her now fell back upon his own shoulders. Merritt's face twisted into a scowl. He yanked on his reins and rode off into the night, defeated. This time, no one followed him. The only sound left was the quiet, steady breathing of a town that had just found its backbone, and it had been forged in the fire of a woman's strength. The autumn wind that swept through the town square carried the sweet scent of baked apples and wood smoke. Lanterns were strung between the buildings, their gentle light swinging over tables piled high with pies, pumpkins, and golden sheaves of wheat. The annual harvest festival. It had always been a celebration Clara had only witnessed from the shadows, an outcast, never invited, never welcomed. But this year was different. This year, she stood in the very center of it all. Children, their faces sticky with cider, darted past her, their laughter bright and free. Townspeople gathered in groups, not avoiding her gaze as they once had, but seeking it out, offering warm nods and genuine smiles. Gratitude, soft and unspoken, glimmered in their eyes. It had only been a few weeks since the fire, since she had single-handedly torn down a wall to save their homes. But in those weeks, something stronger than any wall had been built between them: trust. The mayor's voice rose above the happy chatter. "Miss Clara," he called, standing on a makeshift stage built from hay bales. "Would you come up here, please?" Clara's breath caught in her throat. She froze, her palms suddenly clammy, her heart pounding like that old, hated auction bell. But then Thomas was beside her, his hand resting gently on the small of her back. "You earned this," he murmured, his voice for her alone. That was all she needed. The crowd parted for her as she walked toward the stage. There was no laughter this time, no sneers, only the steady rising sound of applause. It grew louder with every step she took, a wave of warmth and acceptance that washed over her, until she reached the platform and stood bathed in the soft lantern light. The mayor took her hand, his grip firm and warm. "There was a time when some folks in this town called your strength strange," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent square. "But tonight, we see it for what it truly is, a gift. This year's harvest isn't just about the grain in our fields, it's about the person who kept the very ground beneath our feet from turning to ash. Please accept our deepest thanks."
And now, the same people who had once turned their backs on her were celebrating it. As the noise softened, Thomas stepped up onto the stage beside her. He was holding something in his hand, a silver cuff bracelet, delicately engraved with patterns of vines and leaves, polished smooth by years of care. My mother wore this, he said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the square. She gave it to my sister, and when she passed, I kept it. I thought I'd never find anyone strong enough to wear it. Not just strong in the arms, but strong in here. He touched his heart. He turned to Clara, his gaze steady and filled with an emotion that made her heart tremble. You were never too big, Clara. You were always just right. For this town, for this life, and for me.
The crowd fell into a reverent hush. Thomas gently took her arm and slid the silver cuff over her wrist. It caught the lantern light, gleaming against her skin. But it was the warmth in his eyes, the promise she saw there, that held her completely still. She looked up at him, her heart overflowing with a feeling she had long given up hope of ever knowing. Belonging. Then the silence was broken by laughter. Bright, joyful, and not the least bit cruel. A little girl with cheeks flushed from cider tugged on her skirt. "Dance with me?" she asked. Clara smiled, a little nervously. "Oh, I'm not much of a dancer." Thomas leaned in close, his voice low and certain. "You tore down a wall and saved a town," he whispered. "I think you can manage a few steps." The music struck up, a lively tune of fiddles and drums that filled the cool night air. Clara took the little girl's small hand in one of hers, and Thomas's steady, strong hand in the other. And together, the three of them stepped onto the packed earth of the square as the whole town cheered. They weren't spectators anymore. They were family. For the first time in her life, Clara danced. Not gracefully, perhaps, but with a joy so pure and complete it lit her up from the inside out. And this time, when the whole town laughed, they were laughing with her. The music finally wound down, the lantern still swaying in the gentle breeze. Laughter and conversation spilled out into the night, the sounds of a harvest well and truly earned. Clara stood with Thomas at her side, his hand holding hers, the silver cuff cool and solid on her wrist. For so long, her story had been one of shame. The girl sold because she was too big, too much for the world to handle. But here, under the warm gaze of neighbors who had once whispered and mocked, she was someone else entirely. Not a burden, not a stray. She was the heart that had held a town together through fear and fire. Children still clung to her skirt. Women pressed freshly baked bread into her hands. Men tipped their hats to her with a deep, abiding respect. Every single gesture spoke a truth that words never could. She belonged. The memory of that auction platform was still there, a faint scar on her soul, but it no longer had the power to chain her. She had been traded for flour and lard, but she had found a life that was priceless. Her story was no longer just about survival. It was about becoming. Thomas looked down at her, his smile soft and certain. And together they walked away from the celebration, not as outcasts returning to the shadows, but as the anchors of a community they had helped to save and to build. It wasn't a fairy tale ending with a preacher's blessing or a ring on her finger. It was something realer and far more enduring. It was a life built on courage, acceptance, and a quiet, steady love. But this is only one story from a time when the world was still being written. The frontier is full of tales of grit and heart, of women who stood tall when the world told them to kneel, of men who saw past the surface to the strength beneath, and of families forged not by blood, but by fire and by will. If Clara's story moved you, if her fight for a place to belong felt like your own, then don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next trail is waiting and there are so many more stories to tell.